all policy based on force is at least suboptimal, if not outright wrong. If I can't do something in a manner that invites you voluntarily, then I'm wrong. I want to tell you a little story about that. So it has to do with Moses. So Moses is the archetypal figure who fights tyranny and redeems the slave. And so you could imagine that insofar as you're a fully functioning social being who's moral, that's what you do. You oppose tyranny and you grant responsibility and dignity and direction to the slaves. Okay, so that's what Moses does. And he does this for like 4 decades, right? 40 years in the desert. He puts his life on the line. He sacrifices his whole life to this enterprise, standing up against the Pharaoh, which was a deadly thing to do, and then leading his people through their confusion in the desert. So they drop their tyranny and then they're confused for 40 years. Now, just as he reaches the promised land, and so the archetypal structure here is everybody's journeying to the place they want to go to, right? And no matter what you're doing, you're always trying to journey to the place you want to go to. That's the promised land. So Moses has done this assiduously for 4 decades. Now, he's right on the threshold of the promised land. And the Israelites are all bitching and whining and squawking away because they're out of water again. And so Moses goes to God and he says, well, we need some water. And God says, well, you're going to find some rocks. And he tells him where. And he says, go speak to the rocks and they'll issue forth water. And Moses goes, but instead of speaking to the rocks, he hits them with his staff. And his staff is a symbol of authority and tradition, right? So he strikes the rock and then he strikes it again. And the water does come forth from the rock. But God tells him that because he used force instead of words, that he will die before he enters the promised land. It's such a striking, it's such a striking story because you have this person who's as close to a savior as anyone in the Old Testament, right? I mean, Moses, I think he's the central figure of the Old Testament. You could argue about that, but he's certainly a central figure. And so he does things about as well as you could hope anyone could do. And yet, the punishment for him for using force, even in that relatively trivial manner, is that he can't make the utopia make itself manifest, right? That's how dangerous force is. And so maybe we could use as a rule of thumb the idea that anybody who's trying to push you to do anything, if they're actually trying to push you, they're not to be trusted. If they can't formulate their doctrine as an invitation, a voluntary invitation, at minimum they're incompetent and probably they're psychopathic and tyrannical.